Right? Okay. We're here with Professor Jonathan Sarna of Brandeis University, a noted professor of American Jewish history. Thank you so much for joining me on Challenging Jewish History tonight, first of all.
Delighted to be with you.
Okay, so you've been in this field for many years. You've written many books, lectured on this topic for many years in American Jewish history. Tell me, first of all, about your most recent book and what it's about, and how you got into the subject of American Jewish history in general.
So, all right, I do it in reverse order.
Sure.
I actually became interested in American Jewish history already in high school, maybe because both of my parents were immigrants. One scholar wrote that I went into the only field that, in Judaic studies that my father knew nothing about. My father was a well-known scholar, but his field was Bible, Tanakh, ancient Near East. Since he was also a rabbi, he had studied Jewish history, but America wasn't something they taught about. But I actually would say that I went into the field because it merged, on the one hand, America, where I'm the only American born in my family. Yes, I was the only one who could have been president. And on the other hand, the Sarna family was deeply involved in Jewish studies, and this kind of brought the two of them together. But I also learned at a young age, really, that the field was wide open. To say something new about the Bible is hard. To say something new about American Jewish history, especially when I got into the field, was easy. And it seemed to me then, and it's still somewhat true, I hope less true, that American Jews didn't know much about their history, that the subject had not much been studied, certainly not in a scholarly way. And, I was very interested in how these two worlds of Americans and Jews came together. And so that's how I got into the field. And I've always, although I've written on every period in American Jewish history, from the earliest colonial days to the present, I've always liked the 19th century. And so my most recent book really was a discovery I made in the 19th century of really an unknown novel, interestingly by a woman. And it turns out in many ways that the first American Jewish novel is by a woman whom nobody ever heard of. And I was able to work out her biography. I even discovered her diary, named Cora Wilburn. Her novel is Casella Wayne, and the initials CW tell you that it's an autobiographical novel. Of course, Cora Wilburn doesn't sound very Jewish. I also discovered that her original name was Henrietta Pulvermacher. Pulvermacher means powder maker. And we actually have her records when she arrived in the United States in 1844. At a certain point, not perhaps so surprisingly, she changed her name and published as Cora Wilburn, and then adopted that as her name. And actually, name changes are an important phenomenon in the book, where she talks a lot about that theme. So while the novel itself, I don't think is, rivaling Saul Bellow, it's very, very important historically for many reasons. And number one, its early date. Number two, that it's a spiritualist novel. Interested in the spiritualist movement, which was important at that time. Spiritualists believed that there was a kind of hidden spirit world that one could appeal to. Spiritualism is especially significant in the Civil War. Not surprisingly, people had children who died. They took comfort in the idea that the spirit of their children lived on, and they could even communicate with those spirits. That was not the motivation of Cora Wilburn, who had become a spiritualist even earlier, but she was an orphan. She had no living relatives, and spiritualism gave her an opportunity to, kivyachol, so to speak, talk with her mother, who had died. Eventually, she leaves spiritualism, returns fully to Judaism. But in any case, the story is very interesting, and some of her writing is interesting, and used to travel to sell gems, a very old Jewish occupation. He actually was, I discovered, a crooked gem merchant, and so he would sell phony gems and rush out of town. Eventually, he either dies or is murdered in Venezuela, and she lives in Venezuela. That's also interesting, and there's a lot of discussion of Venezuela, and then moves to the United States. So that's the most recent, but very different, I have to say, from my other work, but I think an important contribution to women's history, and I'm hoping that others will work on the poetry and the prose, fiction and nonfiction, of Cora Wilburn, who's one of our earliest American Jewish writers. But I'm not, I think, going to do more there. My next book is called Coming to Terms with America, and it really brings together some of my articles over many years dealing with being an American, being a Jew, and the interrelationship, whether it's trying to synthesize being an American or being a Jew, the world of Athens and Jerusalem, Jews who imagined that their cities were like Cincinnati, were Jerusalem on the Ohio, and what the implications of that were, and so on. Religion and state issues that brought Jews and Americans to interact. And I hope that people will realize that the tension or between the pulls of being American and being Jewish, as well as the efforts at promoting interaction and being at home in America and gaining a place in America, that these are very important themes. And I've tried to bring together many of my thoughts on that big subject in the next book. God willing, will be out in another year.
That's great to hear. I'm looking forward to reading that and interviewing you post that. I want to talk about the beginnings of American Jewish history. I think I was reading a classic, though albeit flawed, book about I'm sure you've come across it, Stephen Birmingham's The Grandees on the early American Sephardic Jewish community. And I've been very fascinated recently with what I think is kind of an unknown chapter in early colonial Jewish history in the Americas. And although, like I said, that book is not exactly a very accurate historical account of the beginnings of Jews in what later becomes the United States, I think it's a very entertaining kind of good intro for people who are not familiar at all with the topic. Which leads me to my, I guess, question/observation, and that is, why is there so little written about the early Spanish Portuguese Jews who arrived on these shores? Yeah, let's start with that.
So actually now there's begun to be a revival. These were Western Sephardim, of course. There are, and the reason I stress that they were Western Sephardim is that it means they had not gone from Spain, Portugal to the Ottoman Empire. Instead, many of them had lived for a time as conversos. They, in many cases, not all, many cases gone to Holland, where they could, so to speak, come out of the closet, and then they came to the New World. But we definitely have Jews, and not a few, who had come from the Iberian Peninsula, and in some cases, they had lived like the Aaron Lopez, who was one of the wealthiest merchants in Newport, a remarkable figure. They had lived underground for a couple of 100 years, which is a long time. He makes his way from the Iberian Peninsula to Rhode Island, and suddenly changes his name back from Duarte to Aaron, becomes fully Jewish and quite seriously Jewish, and resumes Jewish life, and so do his descendants, and he manages, it's quite exciting to get some of his relatives out of the Iberian Peninsula and brings them to the New World. There certainly is some scholarship on this. Jacob Rader Marcus's Colonial American Jew is largely about the Sephardic Jews, but now, as I say, there's exciting new work. Laura Lieberman is the most important of these scholars. I think that we increasingly realize that the story is not just about North America. It's really a story that involves the whole of the Atlantic world, and especially a story that involves the Caribbean, meaning that places like Curacao and Jamaica and Barbados, these are much more significant communities, really, than the North American Jewish communities. And they also, by the way, were more deeply Sephardi. North American communities were mixed. But in any case, there is now a lot of comparative study of these communities, and I hope there'll be more work. And as America itself becomes a home for more Sephardi, Mizrahi Jews, I think there's more and more interest in the Sephardi heritage of the United States, and I expect there'll be even more work, although it is important to remember that the Eastern Sephardic tradition, or the Jews who lived in Arab lands, that's a somewhat different history than the Western Sephardim. Many of the Eastern Sephardim did not experience periods of where they lived underground. Even their religious lives are different. The prayer book of the Western Sephardim differs substantially from the traditional Mizrahi Eastern Sephardic prayer book. Nevertheless, they're all part of the Sephardic diaspora, very proud of their non-Ashkenazi character. And now that we have a significant proportion of American Jews who are coming from that Sephardic world, Mizrahi world, I think will see more interest in that subject. So, I think each generation focuses in different ways. I don't expect that Birmingham's work will hold up so well, partly because his research base was not very deep, but we have a lot of letters and a lot of records of these early Sephardi Jews, the Sashuses, the Sheret Israel, Mikveh Israel, and so on. And they certainly could stand to be more deeply studied and analyzed.
Right. Going off on a tangent for a second, when I messaged you a bunch of years ago, I was doing some research on Sephardic Jews who ended up in Eastern Europe, and you had mentioned that your own family has such a tradition. Is that
sure?
True?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Astonishingly, actually, on both sides of my family.
Really?
My name, of course, is Sarna, and that's pure Polish, but there is a very strong family tradition, and backed up actually now through the DNA test, that the family had roots in Spain. The tradition of the family is that it goes back to no less than Don Yitzhak Abravanel, one of the great figures of Spain, who of course traced himself back to King David. I couldn't prove how that happened, but we know that there were Sephardic Jews who made their way to the centers in Poland after the expulsion. And actually, on my mother's side is another example of that. My mother was a Horowitz, a very famous a Jewish family, going back to Rabbi Yeshaya Horowitz. The name Horowitz, of course, is simply the town, Horavici or something, where they settled. But that was not the original name at all. And there we have good records of how they crossed from the Sephardic world into the Ashkenazic world, although keeping the tradition that they had originated in Spain and were Leviim and so on. I think the name was Halevi, and then moved over. So in other words, the big theme is that although we teach that Ashkenazim and Sephardim, they were totally separate worlds, and it developed in certain different traditions, but there was a lot of crossover and intermixing. It was still one Jewish world. There were people who visited back and forth, and there were Sephardic Jews who ended up in the Ashkenazic world, and vice versa. So it's a much more complicated a Jewish history that reflects on the vast migrations, really, of the Jewish people. And I'm sure that those migrations also brought learning and innovation in both directions. So it's a very important subject. And it's wonderful now that we are seeing more and more work on the Sephardic world. There's a whole group of very significant scholars, Sirach Raviah Stein and others, who are approaching this material now, and that will rewrite aspects of Jewish history.
It's interesting that you say, talk about intermixing. There was so much intermixing throughout the diaspora since the Spanish expulsion, even beyond, before that, you had Rabbeinu Asher, the famous Rosh, who went to Toledo from Germany. I mean, you have constant comings and goings, as I put it, from Ashkenazic centers to Sephardic centers and vice versa. And then you, in the context of American Jewish history, it's so interesting to note the intermixing between Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities in America by the 1800s. I think the early 1800s, would it be accurate to say that most Sephardic communities were already intermixed or intermixing with local immigrants from Germany on the second generation?
Yeah, you see, a very interesting thing. Whereas, let's say in London or in other places, the Ashkenazim and the Sfaradim worshipped in different congregations. There was the Ashkenazi community and the Sephardic community, say, what in London is called the Beavers Marx community and the Great Synagogue community. That is not the case in the United States. It was small, and everybody had to daven together. There was only one synagogue, and that's true in New York, and that's true in Newport, and that's true in Savannah and Charleston and Philadelphia. In each one of them, until the 19th century, there's one congregation, everybody has to join. Well, that meant, even though each of those congregations followed the Sephardic nusach, the Sephardic tradition and minhag and custom, minhag is better than nusach, the Sephardic minhag, it was inevitable that Ashkenazim and Sephardim would marry one another. The community was very small. The alternative to marrying what Sephardim called a tedesco was intermarriage. And obviously you preferred that even Gershom Satius, who was so important as the Chazan of the community and one of the most respected members of the community, his wife was Ashkenazi, Mordecai Noah, who is a very, probably the best known of the early 19th century American Jews, because he's a journalist and a playwright and a diplomat and had once an idea for a Jewish colony. Same story. He's a member of Shearith Israel, is very proud of his Sephardic ancestors, but he also had Ashkenazic ancestors. And that was true of a great many people. Malcolm Stern showed many years ago how many marriages there were between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. And over time, as more and more Central European Jews from German and Polish lands come in the 19th century, so the Sfaradim, in a sense, find themselves on the defensive. They are diminished. And of course, even today, if you go to many of the Sephardi congregations, you'll find that there are plenty of members who have Ashkenazi roots, or at least some Ashkenazi blood. You then have a new wave of Sephardim, actually a much larger wave, and that's only begun to be studied. These were Jews from the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottoman Empire begins to decay, we see more and more Jews from Rhodes, from the land of Israel, from other parts of Turkey, Salonika, and they come to America as well. And they, of course, are Ladino speaking. And for half a century, you had a Ladino press in the United States, America, and so on. Over time, they too tend to intermarry with the Ashkenazim. After all, again, who are you going to meet and interact with? But there are communities. Seattle is a good example where the world of the Sephardim is very significant. They carefully maintain customs, even culinary practices are carefully maintained. And there are other, New York is a well-known community, but Atlanta, Cincinnati, they all have Sephardic communities of different sizes. And then after World War II, and especially after 1965, when immigration laws in America are altered, so then we see more and more Jews, some from Arab lands, some who may have initially gone someplace else, France or Canada, but then made their way to the United States, Jews, let's say from Algeria, Tunis, and some went to Eretz Israel, went to the land of Israel, and also then came to America. So today, it's a quite significant percentage of the American Jewish community, and it's quite recent, but one really sees more and more synagogues that follow the Sephardic practice. Many of the newer congregations follow the Mizrahi practice rather than the Western Sephardic one.
Right. It's interesting that you pointed out the distinction that a lot of people fail to make between Eastern Sephardim and Western Sephardim, who are quite different in terms of language and culture. Interestingly, the She'eretz Israel Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York, when the wave of migrations from the crumbling Ottoman Empire began, and Jews from Greece and Turkey, Ladino-speaking Jews, came to New York City, they weren't exactly accepted into the She'eretz Israel right away. They were kind of given the cold shoulder. The rabbi at the time, who I think was it De Solapool or Mendez?
Right, David De Solapool was long-term rabbi, and he welcomed those Sephardic Jews and kind of championed them and wrote about them and helped them and created this sense that Sephardic Jews help one another, even if their backgrounds are different. But of course, there were plenty of Sephardic Jews who were accustomed to their own ritual. And the most interesting are the Yanina Jews, not technically Sephardim, but certainly not Ashkenazim. They go back to the Romaniot community. Crucial, because during World War II, the Yanina community back in Yanina is completely wiped out. And many of the Yanina traditions are actually only preserved, as I understand it, thanks to the congregation in New York that had, that was, we would call it, there's a Roman term, the Lunchman congregation. This was a congregation that adhered to the Yannana community, supported Yannana, proud of their Yannana descent, and they really became the survivors of that community who kept it going. There were other, if you look closely at Sephardic congregations, you'll often find, and Seattle is a good example, oh, this one follows the custom of roads, and this one follows Salonika, and so on. Over time, those differences become less important, but there were plenty of Sephardic congregations that tried to adhere to the customs of what we would call the old country.
Right. And then
I'm sorry, you.
Rabbi Angel, who you hear me?
Not well. Something's gone wrong. I missed the whole thing. Maybe try to say the question again. You froze a few times. Yeah.
You hear me now?
Yeah. Try it. Yeah.
Okay. So it's interesting. She'eretz Israel has a fascinating long history here in New York. Rabbi Mark Angel wrote a couple of a monograph on She'eretz Israel's history. He himself is, of course, of Eastern Sephardic background from the Island of Rhodes.
Yeah, sure.
And today you have a completely Ashkenazi rabbi, Reb Meir Soloveitchik, who is kind of interesting. I mean, you wouldn't think that the original founders were envisioning anything like that. And most of She'eretz Israel's membership is a mixture of a Sephardic and Ashkenazic. Many of the Sephardic families, especially the Nathans, who are probably the oldest Sephardic family in New York, if not the United States, one of the few remnants, also heavily mixed with Ashkenazim over the generations. It's interesting because you don't have a lot of descendants of the original Sephardic settlers or Ashkenazic original settlers, all that many. I mean, you have a history of intermarriage. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, when you look at where are the descendants of all the, the Sephardic founding fathers? There aren't that many. You have the Nathans and maybe some others.
Well,
you have in Charleston, another fascinating example.
Yeah, Savannah. In Savannah, it's nice because the earliest families were the Sheftals and the Minuses, and you can still find people with the name Sheftal and Minus in Savannah. Some of them are Jewish, some of them are not Jewish, but they have the name. If one carefully studies the work of the great genealogist Malcolm Stern, often you can see what happened to the family. Sometimes they simply married Ashkenazim, or there were famous families that only had daughters, and so the names would follow the husband. It's important to know that there were plenty of Jews in the early period who remained single. Sometimes there weren't many choices, and they said, look, rather than marrying a non-Jew, I won't get married. Even a famous person like Rebecca Gratz, according to tradition, she loved a non-Jew but wouldn't marry him. But in other cases, as you say, in America, it was a free country and easy to marry a non-Jew. The state didn't ask that question. And so a great many people did marry, and did intermarry. And there are millions and millions of Americans who are part Jewish, who discover, oh, I have Jewish heritage, but they're not Jewish themselves, and unfortunately, that's only increasing. Whether you look at the Trumps or Kamala Harris or Joe Biden and so on, you all see Jewish parts, or Clinton, Jewish parts of that family, but eventually, in many of those cases, it becomes part of their heritage, like people who know that they're part Cherokee, so they know they're part Jewish, and that disappears. But there are, I had myself a direct descendant of Chaim Solomon in my class. I knew his name was Andrew. It's easy to see how that was a direct descendant of Chaim Solomon. If you go to Malcolm Stern, and so there certainly are people who are descendants. And then you have a whole story that nobody has researched, and that is of Jews in the South who had children with African Americans, slaves or free people of color. Usually the Jew was a male, the non-Jew was, the person of color was a female. And that should be the most famous example is Judah Turo. I mean, all the books will tell you that he didn't have any children. One book suggests that he was wounded in the War of 1812 in such a way that he couldn't have children, but actually we now know was only wounded in such a way he couldn't have white children. He did have black children, and we know the story, and there are descendants. I personally met a descendant of Judah Turo in Newport, a very prominent and proud African-American family, proud of their Jewish ancestry, but because the mother was, of course, not Jewish, she was a free woman of color, as they called them in those days in New Orleans. They know they are not Jewish, even though they have Jewish DNA, what in Hebrew would be called Zera Yisrael, courses through them. And that is much more common in the South than people realize. It was a whole feature of Southern society. I mean, among non-Jews as well, of course, that men would bear children with black women who were, in a sense, their mistresses. And you can even find throughout, not only you can find in New Orleans rules about this, but if you go to the Caribbean, there's been now a lot of work by a former student of mine, I'm very proud of, Aviva Ben-Ur. She's done tremendous work on Suriname, and it's easy to see the enormous significance of the descendants of liaisons between Jewish men and slave women. Indeed, there were, in Suriname, there were all sorts of rules, as well as a separate cemetery that really was used for those people. So I'm sure that there will be much, much new scholarship on all of those subjects. They were taboo for a long time. There were people who looked at them. Now, of course, there's a great deal of interest in those subjects. And I think we'll see much more scholarship going forward.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, you have so many people, prominent non-Jews, who claim Sephardic ancestry. What struck me most is many years ago, Farrakhan, of all people, claimed to be descended on his. He said his father was a white Portuguese from a Sephardic family in the Caribbean. Recently, never know.
It's certainly possible. Yeah.
Possible. Just now, Nick Cannon,
Right.
Cradle, also claimed to have Sephardic ancestry, and as one part of his family is also from the Caribbean. And you have many others who are like the rapper Sean Paul has claimed Sephardic ancestry. I mean, this is so common. It's a very fascinating subject. I'm hoping someone will actually do more, write a lot more about that. Let me get back to early American Jews and patriotism. Studying early American Jewish families, you come across names, and names reveal a lot about people. When I look at names like Thomas Jefferson Tobias from Charleston, South Carolina, this was a name that was repeated over several generations. A fascinating family. And when you look at Benjamin Franklin
Peixoto, right, from a very famous Sephardic family, often spelled differently with C's, but all the Peixotos are related to one another. You find them in England, the New World. Yeah, and that shows that's wonderful. If you look at my article on the cult of synthesis, that is the bringing together of the American and the Jewish. You want to prove your loyalty to America, and it's interesting who they chose. Yes, Thomas Jefferson, who exponent of religious liberty, or Benjamin Franklin, who actually donates money to a synagogue and is pluralistic, obviously. You can find a few others. Washington. Other figures, of course, are not so remembered. But Jews wanted to prove their loyalty. Andrew Jackson, you find, and they took on these names as a way of proving it. Later, Abraham Lincoln becomes something of a Jewish saint, and you have quite a few Jews, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, whom you can find with the name Lincoln. Lincoln Wolfenstein, or was a famous physicist, and other Lincolns as well. Today, that's not as common, but it's really quite fascinating, and I think he deserves much more work. That Benjamin Franklin Peixoto, very important figure, and you can really see on the one hand how devoted he is to the Jewish community. He's president of B'nai B'rith. He goes off to Romania, where he does amazing work as an American diplomat to help Jews persecuted in Romania. Romania, by the way, is a place where you see both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and came together. And yet he born in America, Peixoto, and is deeply American and proud of it. And that was really their ideal, to be both. He had, I would say, more Jewish knowledge than many native-born American Jews. He clearly had studied, and that also made a difference. There were Sephardic leaders and Ashkenazic leaders who managed to have a lot of students, and then you have people who really didn't know anything. Peixoto knew. He knew Hebrew and so on.
It's interesting also that I read a different book about a very interesting character who lived in London by the name of Samuel Falk, who known as the Baal Shem of London, right? Of course.
London.
Right.
Never comes to America, yeah.
Yeah. He was apparently a member of a Masonic rite, and maybe we can talk a little bit about Jews and Freemasons. In the book that was published on the Baal Shem of London by Michal, forgot her last name. She I think she said she opined that the reason why a lot of Jews joined Masonic clubs is because the Masonic clubs were much more enlightened and tolerant, and the Jews wanted to have a certain sense of belonging.
No,
Is that
I mean, you can find the pioneer of scholarship on Jews and Freemasons was the great Jewish historian Jacob Katz. He works much more in the German lands, and he saw Masonry as a kind of semi-neutral society, indeed, as places where Jews and Protestants, Catholics tended not to be Masons, Jews and Protestants could interact on a semi-neutral turf. As it turns out, the Scottish Rite Masonry is even more tolerant, and Jews bring Scottish Rite Masonry to the United States. Michael Hayes is the person who is credited with bringing it, and we have huge numbers of significant early American Jews who are very important in Masonry. It was a way that Jews could rise up, but through the ranks and attain status. And as you say, it was also a place where Jews and liberal Protestants could interact. There certainly are examples. There's some very new work using newly available Masonic journals, and one can see that there were examples of prejudice against Jews in some of those journals, but at the same time, you can see pushback against that. So, in a way, you can see a kind of microcosm of the battle. Are we fully acceptable or not? And in some Masonic centers, there were. In some Masonic, there was resistance to Jews. But it's quite fascinating to see the number of Jewish Masons, and as I say, some of them are very, very significant Masons in terms of their ability to move up through the ranks.
okay? Interesting. Two more topics, and then I'll let you go. It's getting late. First, what happens in Charleston with Congregation Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim? A very fascinating factoid in American Jewish history that most people that I communicate with aren't aware of. In terms of the Charleston being called the cradle of Reform Judaism in America, and you have a very unlikely crucible. Beth Elohim is a Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, and there was the breakaway with Aaron Harvey, correct?
Isaac Harvey, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know I would not think that you would find that being kind of Ashkenazic Sephardic, there's really a generational divide there. It's a Sephardic synagogue, absolutely, but it has quite a few Ashkenazi members because Beth Elohim is the only synagogue in Charleston. And in 1825, you really see young people, and their concern is our children are not going to be interested in Judaism unless Judaism changes. The services are much too long. We don't understand them. Charleston had, including Harvey. Harvey didn't know Hebrew. They had these were often highly educated. Harvey is one of the most educated people in America. I had vast reading, but didn't know Hebrew, as I say, and they wanted a service that would be much closer to Unitarianism, and it's perfectly clear that they were influenced by the Unitarian Church, which had set up in Charleston, and the minister was interested in them, and they thought, why can't we similarly pray to one God? They certainly would, but have much more English, have sermons, and have a short service. And they first petitioned Beth Elohim, and of course Beth Elohim says we can't change. Sephardic Jews believe that tradition, that's what holds us together. The same tunes, the same prayers. This goes against everything we believe. And so they secede and create the Reform in 1824-5. They secede, create the Reformed Society of Israelites. Actually, a much longer title. It's in my book, the long title, and talking about Judaism's purity in spirit. And you can really see certain even kind of Karaite themes, meaning they don't know anything about the Talmud, but they believe, and this is Protestant influence, that just as the Catholics and the priests had, in Protestant way of thinking, distorted Christianity, so they argued the rabbis and the Talmud had moved us away from the purity and spirit of Judaism, which is much more biblical than rabbinic. And the Reformed Society institutes its own prayer book. We have several, 3-4 recensions of that prayer book, and they bring in other reforms. Even though the Reformed Society goes out of business, because Charleston, for reasons that have nothing to do with the Jews, goes into a deep recession. The reason Charleston goes into a recession is, first of all, the Erie Canal, and second of all, the impact of the great slave revolt in Charleston. And between those two, Charleston goes into a deep recession. A lot of Jews leave. Eventually, Harvey leaves. So the Reformed Society goes out of business. But in 1840, the majority of Beth Elohim is going to be more liberal. And when the synagogue burns down in a terrible fire and they rebuild it, they are going to put in an organ. There's a big fight over that organ. It eventually goes to court. The court says, sorry, this is America. We don't get involved in these religious matters. It follows the majority. The majority vote for the organ, and the minority secede and form a congregation which they call, interestingly, She'erit Yisrael. Going to a Sephardic name, they want it to maintain the tradition of the remnant of Israel, the original She'erit Israel of New York, and then Charleston has two congregations, one traditional, one reform. But it's important to remember that every American Jewish community between the mid-1820s and the Civil War is going to see the creation of multiple synagogues. So whereas from the 17th century to the 1820s, every Jewish community had one synagogue, and all the Jews had to make peace and worship together, and the synagogue and the community is one and the same. That's why when they call themselves Kahal Kadosh, it is a Kahal Kadosh. The community and the synagogue are the same. After the 1820s, Charleston, New York, and every other city every other city of any size sees multiple synagogues, and we move from the synagogue community model that had existed for 175 years or so to a community of synagogues, meaning that the community will have multiple synagogues. Those synagogues will have different traditions. One of them may be Sephardic. Almost every community had one, at least, Sephardic congregation, and some are founded later, like New Orleans or Boston, but the majority Ashkenazi, and those Ashkenazi congregations will follow multiple traditions, some German, some Polish, some Dutch, and so on. Just as Protestantism in America has many different denominations and many different ways of being a Protestant, so Jews come to say, well, in America, there can be many ways of being a Jew. And that has vast impact on American Jewish life to this day. And as you point out, it has its start in Charleston, which, remember, in those days is the largest or second largest Jewish community in the United States. There were two big port cities, Charleston, New York, and those were the two great communities. With the Erie Canal and other problems, Charleston goes down. But we forget that there were many years when Charleston was the largest Jewish community between the Revolution and 1825.
Right. In closing, last question, it's a biggie. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing American Jews today? And what is your prognosis for American Jewry?
So, look, I think that even though we talk a lot about anti-Semitism, and there's no question there's been a rise in anti-Semitism, American Jews are in far greater danger of being loved to death than being hated to death, meaning there's no stigma today in the American Jewish community, in the non-Orthodox community. There's no stigma about marrying a non-Jew. The rate of intermarriage in the non-Orthodox community is very, very high, well over 50%, much closer to 70%. And now, many of those people will bring up their children as Jews, just as Kamala Harris and her husband, she adopted or is raising those children are being raised Jewish, even though and Mrs. Harris is a Baptist. But the question really is long-term, whether youngsters who are brought up that way, will they also in time intermarry, and that you have kind of regression to the mean, meaning that over time they become more and more like the majority. Will there be a kind of slow assimilation out of existence, which has happened to a lot of groups. Think the Huguenots. The Huguenots were Calvinists, expelled from France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. There were many, many more Huguenots. The correct pronunciation is Huguenot, but in America they were called Huguenots. Many more of them than there were Jews. You can see Huguenot churches in New York to this day. Not many people have ever met a Huguenot, and the reason for that is that they had an enormous intermarriage rate, and they intermarry out of existence. The Zoroastrians, great tradition, thousands of years, pretty well intermarried out of existence. So that's the challenge that Jews face. How do you preserve your tradition, your civilization, in a world where there's no stigma about marrying non-Jews? Non-Jews are happy to marry Jews. There are many examples of people who are happily married to someone of another faith, but the question is, can you then pass on a Judaism, or is it inevitably watered down? And I would add to that whereas 2 generations ago, you had a significant community that had received hundreds of hours of Jewish education. It may have been supplementary, but it was 3 days a week, 4 days a week. In Boston, 5 days a week. That was a lot of education supplementary. Today, that middle has disappeared. So you have, say, 10 to 20% who are very well educated in Jewish day schools and the like. And then you've got a much larger group that doesn't hardly know anything about what Judaism is. The haves and the have-nots, the middle has disappeared, just like in American economy, so in the American Jewish world. There is an enormous education gap between those two worlds, and that's a very dangerous and serious problem. And we're seeing the implications because the have-nots don't really understand about Israel. They haven't really learned why there's an Israel. What should our relationship be? They don't understand any of this because how much can you teach in 2 or 3 hours of Sunday school? Not very much. That, to my mind, is the long-term great danger to the American Jewish community. It's kind of easier to talk about anti-Semitism because no one's in favor of anti-Semitism, so we can all unite. It's terrible, and indeed, it is terrible that it's risen, but the much greater danger, it seems to me, remains at what I described. Now, you asked me to predict the future, but I actually am opposed to that idea. Predicting the future means that it's all in heaven, it's all been pre-decided. Our job is just to find smart people who predict what will happen, and then I can go back and watch television and see how it turns out. Absolutely wrong. We will decide the future. The future is absolutely in the hands of the American Jewish community and world Jewry. If we do work hard and we educate and we bring Jews back and so on, then there'll be a better future. If we don't, then as happened in some of those Caribbean communities, it just kind of dribbles away and there's nothing left. All you have are empty synagogues as memorials, so to speak, of a Jewish community that was once there. But the most dangerous thing would be for American Jews to feel that, it's all decided somewhere else. I don't have to do anything. Now, as in every point in our history, our future is in our hands. And that's true really of every American Jew. How are you raising your children? And what are you giving to them? And what messages? And so on. And that will really determine the future of the Jewish community. I will say, every generation of American Jews going back to the 17th century has worried, there'll be no future for the American Jewish community. Everybody will disappear. And that's good, because we worked very hard to make sure that that prediction doesn't happen. And I hope that will be the case now, that we will work very hard and kind of muddle through another generation as we have in the past. But that will really depend on the energy, the funding, and the intensive efforts of the American Jewish community.
Well, powerful words, wise words. I really appreciate that. Well, we're certainly trying to do our part here with Channeling Jewish History to disseminate as much education and knowledge about Jewish history and culture. So we really appreciate you taking talk to us and our viewership. And I want to thank you again. We're Dr. Jonathan Sarna, noted professor and lecturer, author. We'll put a link to your work on the YouTube video. And thank you again. All right.
Well, thank you, and best of luck to you. Be well. Bye-bye.